Welcome back to the channel. Today I thought I'd do something new. I thought I'd take listener questions. These are questions that we've gotten emailed to the podcast, given us to YouTube, and we put them all together. I've picked some from different themes. Here goes. What are your thoughts on the current lockdowns in Europe? So I assume this person is talking about what we see going on right now, the lockdown for unvaccinated people in Austria. We have a partial lockdown in the Netherlands, and this is in the face of rising cases. What are my thoughts about this? I guess I would say that I think, had it not been for what we had witnessed in Western societies from China, had we not seen lockdown in early 2020, it would not have been a pandemic option. It was something that the idea was only introduced to us by us watching Wuhan, and that's something that we talked about in a recent podcast with ID Ethics' Zeb Yamrozik. But I think the challenge has been we've done very little to figure out when and under what circumstances these lockdowns offer a net benefit to people. It's possible that under some narrow range of circumstances, a lockdown or partial lockdown or something like that might slow the spread of the virus in a way that actually meaningfully improves long-term outcomes for people. It's also possible that it doesn't help under many circumstances. Those circumstances might be the allegiance with which people follow the rules, the rate of spread in the community at the time. The only way to tease these two things apart is to do careful empirical studies, which we simply have not seen. And so I worry a little bit that lockdowns in Europe will be more harm to the people, but may not serve the intended purpose or may be on top of a natural ebb and flow of the disease. So I guess I'm not sure about that. I think that we are going to have a long and hard conversation about whether or not in free societies we're willing to do this. If so, what are the rules? And to do that, you need science in place to tell us if they work, and if so, under what circumstances. I will put a link to something I wrote on MedPage Today many months ago about the evidence base for lockdowns and how it is so little and so lacking. Next question. Who politicized the virus? Okay, I thought this was a very interesting question because I think this person is referring to the fact that if you look at the left and right policy polls in the United States, there are certain positions that get associated with both. So on the left, pro-lockdown, pro-masking, pro-mask mandates, pro-vaccine mandates, and wanting to mask very young children, and even school closure, I think, has been bundled into the aggressive policies on the political left in the United States. On the right, I think you see a fervent support, at least in the extreme right, for things like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or unproven pills. I think there is a general antipathy towards masking, certainly mask mandates, certainly a reluctance to mask young kids, certainly more pro-school opening. Vaccine mandates, I think not. I think there's sort of broad agreement with a slight gradient by political party for vaccinations in general, which I think are a tremendous good for adults. Who politicized this? Who did it? I think the truth is a little bit on both sides, you know? I think extreme members of both parties did a good job of linking some of these positions to a political party in a way that doesn't really make sense. There's nothing inherently left about wanting schools closed. I think that decision I've talked about on this podcast was largely in opposition to a man on the right who they really disliked, who wanted schools open. And so I think we really have to look in the mirror on both sides. The right, of course, politicized, I think, hydroxychloroquine by coming out strongly in favor of that while the evidence was premature. But then the left quickly actually pushed very hard to argue that it was sort of a poison pill. And they've pushed again to say that ivermectin is horse dewormer. I prefer sort of a middle ground approach. I've talked about it on prior videos, where you preserve equipoise, run randomized controlled trials. I'm always reluctant to give any medication in the absence of really good, large, randomized, bias-free controlled trials. You'll have to read all my prior content to get a sense of what that means. Next question. What are your thoughts on demonizing, threats to public health officials, etc.? This is a really good question. I guess I must say, it's not too hard to say this. I'm categorically opposed to threats and demonizing people for holding particular policy positions, even if those people are public health officials doing things that you dislike. I think we have definitely seen that there are people who are outspoken on both sides of the issue. They're the people who are the hashtag zero COVID, let's eradicate the virus, let's all wear N95s in perpetuity, those people. And they get a great deal of grief and hate on Twitter. There's also the group on the other side who are in support of less restrictions, reluctant to embrace vaccine mandates, reluctant to embrace mask mandates, and they also get a lot of demonization. I think if you look at the institutions, there's a nice expose on demonization of scientists in Nature. It did a really good job of showing the way in which the pro-restriction side scientists have been demonized, but not so much the people who argue that restrictions may be a double-edged sword, may have unintended consequences. They did not really get some protection in that Nature piece. I think we would all be better off if we didn't demonize the people, didn't make it about people, but made it about a real policy dispute. It is a real policy dispute what the powers of the state are in times of crisis and who decides and how is it measured and how do you judge the response of the state. That's a real dialogue that needs to be fostered among academics without demonization or certainly not threats. Thoughts on lab leak? I've said over and over, I am not the expert on lab leak. I am not the sequencing expert of the virus. But what I will say is I was categorically opposed to censoring people being able to talk about the possibility of lab leak. I also think that we see emerging reports from the NIH showing that they may have been a bit dishonest about what they knew in terms of the research that was going on in Wuhan. I think this is a live issue that requires deep exploration and impartial exploration. And so I hope to learn more about that topic. Who's your target audience? That's a good question. It may surprise you, but I don't really think about the audience. No offense to you all. Appreciate you listening or watching, but I think about what I would want to listen to myself and what I don't get. Even when I look across the million channels of social media or tens of millions of channels, I don't get this type of content aside from very few places. And so I thought that's an interesting niche to fill. So my target audience are people who are interested in this content, which is policy, empiricism, medical evidence, in an apolitical fashion, told rather bluntly. Okay, next question. What's going on in the academy? I suspect this person is also referring to the United States Academy or universities, and I think there is something going on there. It's a moment of crisis for universities. Universities are no longer willing to confront very difficult topics in a very open way, and there are many things that are increasingly taboo to talk about, and COVID-19 policy has largely entered that space. Why do I think this is happening? I think universities increasingly feel the pressure of cultural power, which is social media, Twitter, and Facebook, which has a certain view on these issues that is probably not where the set point is for American people. And university presidents and university administrators don't like bad press. And so if they are to have debates and dialogues and roundtables, which they largely didn't do the way I would want them to have done during a crisis like this, but they would get the ire of social media, and they have chosen the less courageous option of not doing those things. Next question, should Fauci resign? Interesting question. I guess the answer is, first, even setting aside all of what you may think about Anthony Fauci, let me put it to you this way. Should an 80-year-old man who has led a federal agency that administers grant funding for 40 years continue to hold that position of power, or step down and allow someone else an opportunity? And I think the answer to that question is yes, step down. Of course you should. No one should be holding these positions for 40 years. Leadership should be a 10 to 15-year business, and you turn over. Science always needs new ideas, new insights, new people. They say science progresses one funeral at a time. I don't mean that about this person, but I do mean there's some truth there in general that you need certain ideas to move aside so that new ideas can take the place. The next point about Fauci resigning, I think, whether or not you like it or not, I do think he no longer is persuasive to a large chunk of the American electorate. He has lost that. He has become linked to a political party. And as such, I think he's lost his ability to be effective. The third reason, I think, is, of course, the noble lies. I think those are deeply problematic. The moment he made that dramatic flip-flop on masking in April of 2020, largely in the absence of new data, the moment he told Don McNeil, former reporter of the New York Times, that he was raising the herd immunity threshold because he thought he could bump up vaccination rates. Those are noble lies. I've detailed it in an article in Slate. I guess I'll put a link to that too in the bottom. And those are reasons why one will lose the trust of the American people. And I do think, yes, he probably should resign. Next question. How are you so productive? That's a good question. I guess this person is probably referring to the fact that it appears I write a fair bit. I think the answer to that question is that I have always been a quick writer. I follow the advice of Hemingway: long periods of thinking, short periods of writing. I think about something for a fair bit before I even sit down to write about it. And by the time I write about it, it's usually entirely thought out in my mind, and it's really a matter of just getting it down on paper. And I think that explains at least the op-eds and commentaries. These videos, I guess, they actually don't take me that much time. I literally have the list of questions, and this is entirely extemporaneous speaking, and there is no take two. There are no many cuts. There are no cuts in the video. It's just the way I talk. And then the last thing I'd say is when it comes to academic publications, the answer to that is, of course, I work with a lot of really good people and often contribute sort of the initial planning of the idea and then sort of reforms along the way. But I'm fortunate to work with people who do a lot of the hard work and put those projects together nicely. Is there a value to Twitter? This is a question that I honestly, I'll answer differently now than I would have 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago, I was quite bullish about Twitter. I would recommend people use it. 5 years later, I think it is increasingly harmful, both to academics, but to the broader public discourse. I don't think people can read well. I think people have the inability to process arguments, the inability to consider nuance. I think they are often obsessed with follower counts, and so they can't even hear things from people they view as having unjust numbers of followers, etc. I think they easily segregate into tribes. I think there is cultural warfare on Twitter. People act in a disinhibited way and say things they would never say in real life. It's really gotten quite bad, and I'm not sure anyone's being persuaded there anymore. I really think it's no longer what I would advise people, which leads to the next question: career advice for young trainees. I'm going to take this to mean young medical professionals, people who want to be researchers. And my advice for young trainees, I suppose, would be, one, before you set out on what you want to do, take a week, take 2 weeks, travel, meet with friends and family, and really think about what you want to do. I think the biggest problem I encounter is people haven't been honest with themselves about what they actually want from their life, their career. And so often it's easy to go with the flow. It's easy to say, I'm going to be a researcher like my mentor, even if research is really not what you enjoy doing. It's easy to just move from one rung to the next rung. I think it's important to think about what you want to do. The next thing, I think you should think about where your talents lie, what you're good at, and then decide what it is you want to do. And if you want to do it, just do it. You know, you don't always have to have funding in place to do things. You can take leaps of faith. You can just keep pushing and doing what you're doing and see how life rewards you or punishes you for that. I think that's what I would recommend, because it's really a short period of time, and time goes by faster than you think. You will find yourself doing something you really dislike for a long period of time. Say no to anything you don't want to do. Don't believe anyone who says you have to do this for some future accolade or to keep someone on your good side. Just do what you want to do and try to do things that you think are really going to matter, that make the world a better place, even if other people may disagree with you. Push hard on those things if you believe in it. Are conflicts of interest inevitable? This is a question I suspect I'm being asked because I've done a lot of work on conflict of interest. I guess I will start by putting it in two buckets. I think there are intellectual biases. Some may verge on conflicts, but we'll put that in one bucket. And I think there are financial biases, there are financial payments, and some are, in fact, financial conflicts of interest. So let's define these things. For me, the reason I talk more about financial conflicts in general are that it's like talking about carcinogens. There are many carcinogens, but we talk about tobacco a lot because it is a proven carcinogen, demonstrated to be linked to cancer in many, many studies. And financial conflicts are the proven carcinogen of conflicts of interest. When I think about financial conflicts, not any payment or any exchange of money is a conflict. A conflict is really when one party, let's say Celgene, gives money to another party, let's say a researcher, an independent researcher. Celgene is a unidirectional machine. What do I mean by that? Celgene only makes money from selling Celgene products. They only make money from selling Revlimid. Celgene doesn't make money from not selling Revlimid. So the moment the researcher is linked to an organization or entity with a unidirectional profit incentive, that researcher has the incentive to do that sort of work that is in line with the goals and intentions of the company. Imagine a different scenario. Imagine the researcher is linked to writing a book. And let's say the book is about some controversial subject that I don't care or know much about, eating saturated fat. I can imagine you can write a book about how to be healthy and eat a lot of saturated fat. You can also write a book about how to be healthy and never eat a drop of saturated fat. Having written the book on saturated fat, many people will allege, and I've seen this on Twitter, that the person has a financial conflict because they make money from selling the book. But to me, that's different than Celgene because the book wasn't set in one direction. It doesn't have that unidirectionality to it. And so when you talk about unidirectional conflicts of interest with financial entities, that data is rock solid, and there's hundreds of studies showing that's a problem. For ideas, for intellectual biases, although it is seductive to believe that they are conflicts, we have very few empirical studies showing those conflicts have a net vector of bias. And I think that's the reason why I always have pause there. I think COVID-19 has exposed some things where we might learn more than we knew before. We might very well find that people who said many times, do lockdowns, will publish papers showing lockdowns work, and vice versa for people held the other position. And so it might be a unique opportunity to study whether or not people's scientific contributions using retrospective observational confounded data follow their pre-specified policy preferences. And so I think that's something we will see. So maybe there's an opportunity to kind of take intellectual biases and move them to the next level of quantified carcinogen or quantified bias with a net vector. Last question. What are you working on now? Hold that thought. The battery died on my camera, and so I'm not going to do that last question. I'll save it for next time I do this segment. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, comment, leave a message, subscribe. Until next time. And the question will go to the next set of questions if you want to hear more of this. So